As we go through this, please keep track of questions that come to mind. We'll have time at the end to take those. With that, let's start with the panelists. We'll start at the end with Colin. Just a few words about yourself and what brings you here.
Sure, thanks, Jim. My name is Colin Brenan. I'm the Managing Director for the Monsanto Atlas Seed Fund Alliance. So I'm with Atlas Venture in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And what we do is we look for investment opportunities that are of, well, first of all, good investments, but also are strategically aligned with Monsanto's interests. I can get into this a bit later about how this is sort of investment model you'll see more and more of in terms of these types of strategic partnerships between companies like Monsanto and not only in ag bio, but also in biotech and life sciences, teaming with venture firms, for example, that to leverage risk capital in a thoughtful and insightful way. So my background, I'm a serial entrepreneur that has started and built and sold a couple life science companies, originally out of MIT. And I've been on the entrepreneur side of the table for many years, and now being on the investment side of the table. That I have to say, since we're focused on seed investment, there's not really a whole lot of difference oftentimes between being an entrepreneur and looking to pull together all the resources and figure out what your plan forward is relative to being a seed stage investor, except for the fact they do have a lot more money behind me, so that helps. But I'm looking forward to discussion with the panel, and also to entertain questions you may have about the kind of things we do, and also what can be done to further this whole area of innovation and to bring a lot of ideas that you have. And I thought it was fantastic with IDO, bring all those ideas forward that we can actually make an impact in healthcare more so than we have right now.
Hi, everyone. My name is Donna Sea. I'm from the Technology Transfer Office at Columbia University. I wear a number of different hats at Columbia. I'm the director of the Columbia Culture Translational Research Partnership there. I also run something called Catalyst, which is an SBIR STTR assistance program. And most recently, we've been tapped by New York State as one of the clean tech incubator universities in New York. So I'll be helping to run that. Essentially, those are kind of three programs. We also we run our own internal seed/validation fund at Columbia, which I'm also involved with. I serve on the Life Science Angel Screening Committee Network, Life Science Angel Network Screening Committee in New York, looking for what used to be life sciences opportunities, now healthcare IT opportunities, because that's where the money's interested in going. My background, I have a B.A. from Hopkins, an M.Ph. in health policy, and an M.B.A. from Columbia University. I kind of joke that I've done everything in healthcare. I started my career working at the World Bank doing international economics research, and in the context of that became very interested in international public health, so I spent some time overseas in South Asia, India, and Nepal, doing some what I would call very traditional kind of global health development type work. Came back to the U.S. and ended up working with the CDC and some various state health departments in California and Hawaii, the Region 9 Public Health Service, launching various catch-up vaccination programs for hepatitis B. And the latter part of my career has been in technology development, something kind of different from global health and public health, but in a way targeted to the same end goal, helping people and hoping to bring technologies that benefit society.
I'm Roderick Pettigrew, Director of the National Institute of Biomedical Imaging and Bioengineering, one of the constituent institutes of the National Institutes of Health. At the NIH, there is also a overarching governing body, or advisory body, I should say, actually not governing, but advisory, called the Scientific Management and Review Board, which advises the NIH director on high-level management and organizational issues. And I serve on that board, and one of the issues that has been undertaken by that board recently is how to improve the SBIR STTR program. And that is a topic that we're focusing on at present. There have been a number of public discussions about this activity, the most recent one being a couple of months ago. That was webcast and archived, so those of you who might be interested in hearing those discussions can find that on the NIH website. At my institute, we also support technology development, as many of you are well aware. We have a very active SBIR STTR portfolio. Probably about 25% of all the applications that we get in come in as, you might be surprised, SBIR STTR applications. So quite a sizable number. And in that respect, I think we sort of stand out at the NIH among the other institutes and centers. The most recently developed center and created center, I should say, is a National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences. The director of that center was recently appointed, the permanent director, just about a month ago. And they've been on board functional for about a year. So I would expect that they too would be heavily subscribed by the SBIR community, STTR community, but I don't know that that has happened yet. So I'll be happy to answer any questions that will arise regarding both our interest in and support of translational developments, the NCAT's support of that to the extent that I understand it, and also the direction that the SMRB subcommittee on SBIR and STTR program is going.
Hello. Thanks for staying for the last session on the last day. My name is Mike Dempsey, and I work at a group called CIMMIT. CIMMIT is a nonprofit consortia in Boston. Basically, it's the academic teaching hospitals in Boston. There are 13 member institutions in CIMMIT. There are several engineering schools as well, including Northeastern and MIT. And what CIMMIT tries to do is to make patient impact by bringing together, traditionally it's been clinicians and engineers to solve problems. And CIMMIT's been around for about 14 years. It was founded by Dr. John Parrish, and in the early days of CIMMIT, its focus was pretty straightforward. The equation was you get a clinician who has a problem, you hook her up with an engineer who might have a solution, you pour some money into the mix, and you see what pops out. So CIMMIT was basically a granting organization. We gave innovation grants. About 3 years ago, Dr. Parrish forced us to do a study of all of the projects that we'd reviewed over 10 years. There were about 600 projects that we'd funded, little less than $60 million. It's kind of hard to find some of the performance data for these projects that were a decade old, but we were able to get data from most, and some of the conclusions of that study were that about 30% of the projects that we touched found their way into clinical use. So that's a pretty high percentage given the early stage that we tended to put grants in. But we also determined that that number could have been significantly higher, maybe as high as 50%, if there was a third element in this equation. So not just clinicians and engineers, but also some business intelligence. So a new group was created at CIMMIT, which I'm responsible for, called the CIMMIT Accelerator. And we look at a relatively small number of projects. We look at about 10% of the projects that come through the CIMMIT pipeline. And if they meet our criteria, we will invest money in them, and more importantly, invest staff in them. So the CIMMIT Accelerator team consists entirely of former CEOs and founders of medical device companies. And these folks are at points in their career where they're giving back or interested in their next project or just interested in seeing the interesting projects that come through. Colin, in fact, is a former member of this team. They essentially become interim CEOs for these projects, these ideas. And our objective is in 12 to 18 months to spin these projects out and hand them off to a commercial entity. So practically speaking, what that means is there's either a startup team that's willing to create a new co around them and raise money, or there's a licensing opportunity, so a big co is going to license the technology, or there's a complete sell-off where someone's willing to buy all of it. Unlike our traditional grants, which are very similar to most academic grants, here's some money, Godspeed. If you fail, you've contributed to the body of knowledge. We view these accelerator investments as investments. We take equity in the future proceeds, and we manage the work just like a venture capitalist would manage any of their investments. One of the key differences, though, between us and VCs is our expectation is when someone comes in to propose a project to us, they don't have it all figured out. These are primarily academics. So that's the role that the interim CEO or the prime mover has. To date, we've supported 7 projects. One of them has spun out to be a new co. 2 of them are still sort of in our fold, but they're both cash flow positive and profitable. And then 4 more are still being nurtured. We look at about 1 new project every week. It can come from the CIMMYT family, or it can come from any of you. It can come from outside of CIMMYT as well. And just to wrap up, my background is an electrical engineer, a biomedical engineer, worked for big companies, Philips and other large medical companies, worked for small companies, including founding a couple of companies and raising a reasonable amount of venture money. And then 3 years ago, I joined CIMMYT to lead this effort. So I'm happy to talk about the entrepreneurial side, the alternate funding side, the role that potential academic entrepreneurs have with the tech transfer office, at least in the Boston area, or any other questions you might have. Thanks.
Okay, Howard, are you with us?
I am there.
Okay, take it away.
Can you hear me okay?
I think we can.
I apologize for not being there in person. Sandy and then Nor'easter got me recently, so apologize for not being there in person. My background is I'm a heart failure transplant cardiologist by training. I have a master's in biomedical engineering. I started off in academics at Hopkins and Columbia, where I was the medical director of the ventricular assist program, and did a bunch of basic research in ventricular mechanics and hemodynamics. I left academics, though, to enter the startup world. I have 67 issued patents and 99 pending applications. And my first 3 patents actually were from when I was in academics and licensed out through the technology transfer offices to commercial entities. And since then, I've occasionally tried to license things unsuccessfully, I must say, from university tech transfer offices. So I got some experience on both sides, and Donna, don't make faces or yell at me. Since '96, my inventions or co-invention has started 5 companies that have been acquired or had large investments by strategics like Medtronic or Abbott or Gambro. I've raised about $100 million in venture capital, and those companies have returned over $1 billion in value through acquisition or sales. So what I'm doing now is I just closed a Series A on my most recent company in June, and my business partner, Mark Gelfand, and I are close to closing money on our next incubator. So if there's anything in those experiences that you guys would like to ask about or I could help with, I'd be more than happy to do it.
Fantastic. I think that what you'll notice talking to or hearing from the various panelists is that there's a nice spectrum from closer to the academic side to closer to the company side, and in between there's the venture and some of the translational funding there. And so it's a nice kind of way to look at this transition, its various phases as companies are formed and as projects go through the commercialization process. I wanted to start off with some questions focused on the funding environment. These projects take a lot of different types of resources, and I don't want to overemphasize funding, right? But funding is definitely one of the scarce resources out there, and one that we spend a lot of time thinking about. One trend that I've noticed, and I think if you're in the venture community, you can't help but notice it, because every conference you go to, you hear the same thing the last 2 years, that the life science venture model is broken. I don't know what that means, but it is true, and I think it's a well-settled fact that a number of venture firms that have traditionally been leaders or well-known brands in life sciences have either pulled back or exited from life sciences. And the funds that are still out there, as they go forward and raise new funds, are looking at raising smaller funds, going from funds in the range of 400 to 600 million, to more like 150 to 300, as you kind of look at the industry, just picking general numbers. So turning to the panel, just want to get a sense of the panel's experience with this. Is this a trend they're seeing, and what's the impact been on them and what they're doing in their roles? We'll start with Colin at the end.
Kind of figured that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think in general that there is a tightening up of funding, and I think it in part is due to the economic times we've been through. So in part, there's no surprise there. In terms of return that our limited partners look for, I did pull some numbers out of one of the life science partners at Atlas, Bruce Booth, has a great blog, and I would encourage you all to check that out. That he's had some great insights and really kind of pulls together pieces of information that normally you wouldn't necessarily have a chance, in your busy lives, to be able to see yourself. So. Just a few tidbits that over the past 30 years of aggregate data that's been compiled on deals, these are life science deals, biotech deals returning 2 times the invested capital or greater, that interestingly, despite the hype you hear about Facebook and Instagram and such, that life science investments returned pretty much the same, has pretty much the same level of returns as internet deals, which I thought was pretty interesting, given the fact that you think about biotech, it's investing in very things that take a very long time to come to maturation. On the therapeutic side, diagnostics similar in medical devices, yet the returns are similar. And in fact, failures, and on the flip side, the failures in biotech investment compared to internet deals over the same 30-year time span is about 36% versus 59%. So when you think about it, that you could argue, well, biotech's actually a pretty good investment to make. But I think in part it's all also about the exit side, and that how because the focus is on the capital return, that how do we get our money back, return to our limited partners, is either through a transaction, either a merger or acquisition, or offering of the shares to the public, an IPO. And as you know, that has been, at least on the IPO side, attenuated to a great extent. But M&A actually has been fairly consistent and growing year on year because of the fact that large companies are looking for new sources of innovation. They're struggling. That I think it's well documented that large companies just really can't innovate themselves out of a wet paper bag oftentimes, and they really have to bring in innovation from outside. And this is how they do it. They buy those small, growing companies, typically either at a stage that sort of pre-revenue stage, where they can get access to the intellectual property, the knowledge, the horsepower of the team itself, or wait for the company to reach revenue, gain market traction, and building that so-called hockey stick of revenue, and then they would step in and acquire. So, and that's how I've been successful in the companies I've started, both in life sciences. That companies I started were spun out of technology developed at MIT, and both were acquired, one by Life Technologies, the other by Agilent. And just for that very reason, that we had developed this technology. It's highly speculative, but we had de-risked it to the point where we had significant year-on-year revenues for both of the businesses, and we had also opened up new markets that both these companies were interested in getting access to. And they couldn't do that themselves, but by buying our asset, they were able to do that, and they're willing to pay more money for that. So there is a lot of, many in life sciences, particularly in pharmaceutical, biotech companies, there's a lot of cash on the balance sheet, and that's being leveraged in this way that to be able to acquire that innovation in. That's in part, why Monsanto has teamed with us through the Seed Fund Alliance, is be able to leverage the venture way of thinking about seed funding, early stage, capital efficiency, being active investors to be able to grow those highly speculative but potentially very disruptive ideas from that early stage through to a point where then it could be brought into a company like Monsanto to impact their development pipeline. So I think this is indicative of the kind of thinking you'll see more and more of, as I mentioned earlier in my opening remarks, of teaming of venture capital with larger companies. Either this would be outside, so a lot of companies in the pharma biotech space do have their own venture capital groups internally, and they were more strategically focused. In this case, it's about the return as well as the strategic focus. So it's an interesting mix, and also the fact, and I'll talk a bit later about the fact that there is an ag biotech component in translation, and the translation into potential human healthcare and vice versa. So, in other words, Monsanto is looking for innovation outside of their traditional focus area, which is ag biotech, but in looking at human healthcare, innovation happening in that space, and how that could potentially translate into some of the problems they have.
So Donna, or Michael, as you interact with venture firms, as you look to take projects forward, have you noticed any changes or trends or shifts over the last couple of years? I'll ask Howard as well, although I will say that I think Howard is going to have a different opinion and a different perspective, given that he's got $1 billion of equity value creation under his belt. It's a pretty unique situation. But from the academic side, what are you seeing?
So, I mean, just to provide some historical perspective, I think academic tech transfer office, I think of us as being in our third generation of academic tech transfer. So even as recently as 10 years ago, many tech transfer offices were set up with folks not necessarily with any industry background, a lot of folks that just came from academia straight out of either a faculty position, transitioning cold turkey to business. And that first generation of folks, I think, viewed academic tech transfer not necessarily as a business, but as a service, exclusively as a service to faculty, but not necessarily as a mechanism for bringing technologies to market. I mean, that's my bias, and these views are my own, not my employer's, so I just want to say that up front too. The second generation of tech transfer were those tech transfer offices, or are those tech transfer offices that figured out you actually have to market technologies, you have to define the value proposition, you have to make investments in IP in order to get even a little bit close to where investors and entrepreneurs need to see you. So it's not just sitting back and waiting for folks to come knocking on the door, which there are still tech transfer offices throughout the country that do that, primarily because they're under-resourced, but also because there's some philosophical, underpinnings there as well. Now, I think in the last, I would say, 3 to 5 years, tech transfer offices, the ones who are well-resourced, realize that they can't just market the technologies anymore, because it's basically it's not enough to have a technology in search of a market. You really have to have the market pull. You have to invest in the technology development. You have to bring in resources to enhance the technology transfer staff to be able to de-risk these technologies. And so increasingly you see things like executives and residence programs, EIR programs, technology development funds, which are being supplemented or introduced by donors or by university administration or by local coalitions of economic development agencies in partnership with private groups. And so we're seeing a lot of that in New York. Particularly, not so much in the life sciences sector, but certainly in digital and media and so forth. There's a lot of interest in those spaces. It's a little tougher in the life sciences. New York City had, I think, a very attractive program called BioAccelerate, which is now on hiatus. They gave out grants for 2 years, $250,000 each, to about 3 to 4 projects that were very promising. A lot of those projects had already been kind of partnered with big companies or with investors. But even the city is taking a look at, their returns in the life sciences sector and just saying, that it's a tough market out there, and they don't know how they're going to be able to get returns on their investment. So, funding is extremely tough for early stage. This is one of the reasons that, at least at Columbia and many other institutions across the country, we're looking at SBIR, STTR supplement funds. We're looking at some of the other innovative programs that NIH, NSF, and other agencies are putting together. For example, the Blueprint Neurotherapeutics, that's a fantastic, I think, life sciences translational program that's coming out of the NIH. So, there's money out there, but you have to be, I think, even more creative at finding it and cobbling it together. And then it's not, I would say it's not even only about the money, it's really about finding the right people to leverage that money once you are even able to secure it.
So first I'd like to confirm that I've never heard it described as kind of 3 generations, but I think that's very, very accurate. And also point out that, Columbia has one of the most successful tech transfer offices, certainly in the country, if not the world. So many of us are probably dealing with the 2nd generation tech transfer offices. And I suppose I should also say that these are my comments, not those of my employer, so I don't get fired too quickly. But there's a big impedance mismatch between a typical university and a typical business, right? If you think about the product that a university outputs or an academic medical center outputs, it's students, it's, educated doctors. It's not primarily technology. If you think about what businesses need, to Colin's point, they're looking for de-risked solutions that give them some innovative competitive edge. So I'm sure many of you have experienced this, right? You put you come up with something cool, you file an invention disclosure, you file it with your TLO, and maybe something happens, but probably not. Probably most of the time, if anything happens, it's because you're out pounding the pavement, or you meet someone at a cocktail party or at a conference or something, right? And as someone who's licensed technology in from universities, both successfully and unsuccessfully, I'll say, even the successful in licensing that I've done has been a disappointment, right? I don't get, I get the tech transfer package, I get Appendix A with, some schematics, an invention disclosure, a prototype that maybe works, and, the phone number of a grad student who left 3 years ago. I can't build a business around that, right? So if I talk to my peers in the entrepreneurial world, and again, this is going to be probably a cynical and a somewhat purposefully antagonistic position, but they say, why bother, right? Why bother trying to license something from a university? Why don't I just hire the grad student in, or pay the professor consulting? So there are a few very advanced and sophisticated tech transfer offices. Columbia is one of them, Boston University is one of them, Stanford is one of them, that have overcome that, but that's not the norm. So I think many organizations have been created to try to match this impedance mismatch. That's what my group does, for example, right? We try to negotiate on behalf of the university, try to get the principal investigator to understand what they need to deliver to command a 7 or 10% royalty rate. It's not a couple of lab notebooks and a few papers. It's a complete design history file. It's a de-risked project. It's a valid business plan. It's ideally human data. It's ideally discussions with real customers, people who are willing to pay real money for whatever they've developed. And similarly, we try to get the typical licensees, the people who are looking to consume this technology, to understand the objectives of the university, right? Our job is not to be your R&D. Our job is to train students and to advance knowledge. So this is a very long-winded way of saying if you can recognize that impedance mismatch from the beginning and try to overcome it, understand what the person on the other side of the
Hey, could I break in for 1 minute, Howard?
Okay.
Hey, Howard, let's finish off this
Yeah.
one. Just wait a couple seconds,
Sure.
and we'll hand the floor over to you.
No problem.
So the sooner we all understand what the other people need, the more chance I think there will be of being successful. And that's related to funding too. If it takes money to overcome this impedance mismatch, it takes money to create the design history file or to create the robust package that you want to hand off to, or someone wants to license, that's not traditionally done, and somehow we need to begin to support that.
Yeah. So on this topic of navigating that transition from academia to commercialization through the tech transfer office, Howard, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I want to just say how crucially important that those comments that were just made are. And I think one of the things that's really missed, not on purpose, but just because that's the way it is in academia and universities, is the amount of what constitutes a usable invention by a commercial entity, whether it's a startup or a strategic acquirer. The problem comes in that you have an inventor who's an academic, and they really put into play many times a seminal idea. For example, something like percutaneous heart valve. Now, the problem is because publications are the currency of academics, that inventor, a lot of the time, wants to publish their early results and present them. And many times, the tech transfer office doesn't even hear about these inventions. So, worst case scenario is something is presented and it becomes public domain. But even if they hear about it before the publication, the problem is the university doesn't have the resources to do what's needed much of the time to get it to the point where it's a viable commercial licensable design. And as you said, there'll be a patent filed which describes in great detail the clinical implications of the device. And then you have one single, usually hypothetical device embodiment as an illustration. So in a year and a half after the publication of that, either provisional or utility, now that gets published and becomes prior art to everybody, so including yourself. So now you've just locked yourself out of a lot of European patenting, because the way that things are done there are different than the way they're done here, and sort of what they see is what you get in terms of the claims. And we could talk about that another time if you wanted. But what it really turns out to is the university and the academic inventors just prevented anybody from owning the field. So, a percutaneous heart valve stuff is published. Now anybody can make their own widget, percutaneous heart valve widget. And so you have, hundreds and hundreds of patents by all these people disclosing very sophisticated, better engineered designs, fragmenting the IP estate across multiple companies. So big companies can survive that because if it really is an important idea, they will get protection for their specific thing. But what happens to the academic? What happens to the university? They get nothing out of it, because unless their way of doing it was the absolute best that could be done, which it usually isn't, then you can't you can't generate any value out of that because there's no value to that patent.
So I think Howard, I think that comment is worth spending some time on. And I heard, from the panelists, comment that, both at Columbia and also at CIMMYT, this notion of bringing the VC mindset, to those roles, and how you evaluate projects that are coming in and how you shepherd them through. And I guess the question, is how. So how do you develop those skills? I work in the venture industry, and I haven't developed all those skills. And I've been at it for years. So just this question of how does academia get there?
Well, I can't say that I personally developed the perfect set of skills, or that there's not a better way to do it. But I think that it cost the first $15 million of venture money to transition from academics to the venture world, or to the startup world for real, where I wasn't being too academic or too focused on certain things and not looking at the big picture. For example, I guess the buzzword that everybody uses now, and appropriately so, is we need to look for something that has an unmet clinical need. Instead of making a device so you have a hammer and everything looks like a nail, really what you should do is start off by saying, what's the real problem, and really what's the real market that has to be addressed. Yeah. And if you know the market that needs to be addressed, then it's a worthwhile thing that venture or a strategic investors will put money into. That's one of the biggest problems, find something big enough that they'll do. Because commonly academics do things that have high risk because they're very early stage stuff. And there has to be a large enough market, $500 million, $500 million, $1 billion market, before they'll even sort of look at something like that. So once you know that, then really the question, if you're doing this from a startup point of view, at least what I think it should be, you're looking at everything from what is the technical risks, what are the IP risks, what else is out there? Am I building something somebody else already did? What are the clinical risks? What are the who are the competitors out there? How would my device, or what does my device or therapy need to do to fit into something that makes it unique and somebody else will want? So it's everything from who are the competitors, and then there are even more nuanced things like does that particular potential acquirer for your thing have a sales force that actually sells what you're doing, or would they have to make a totally novel new franchise? And not that they wouldn't necessarily, but there has to be a real good reason to. So I think that startups should be doing things the same way that VCs assess them before they put their time and effort into developing things.
Yep, and let's bring in Michael and the rest of the panel as well on this.
So I'd like to just amplify what Dr. Levin said and make 3 points. One is I'm not sure that the right answer is for academics to start to think more like venture capitalists. My view is academics need to think more like business people. And with no disrespect to the VCs in the room or on the panel, a venture capitalist is an intermediate step between a solution and a customer who's willing to pay for it. If I can fund a venture with customers paying me, that's much better than funding development with a venture capitalist. So, this is getting to Howard's point of understanding the needs of the customer. We have data from this clinical impact study that I referenced. This is my second point. Looking at these 600 projects, we found by far projects had a higher probability of being successful if they had what we call clinical pull. So if the genesis of the project was a clinical problem and not a technological solution, not a, I've got a new gizmo, how can I do something with it, but a, I'm a practicing physician and I don't know, I wish I had a blank. And then the third point I'd like to make is the approach that we in the CIMMIT Accelerator use to de-risk some of these things, and in fact, Howard brought up some of the points, and we use almost exactly the same words, is something called an impact plan. That's on the CIMMIT.org website. It's along with some videos that explain the way it's used. That impact plan, by the way, in our model is also used to establish a pre-money valuation because, again, with no disrespect to the VCs, every firm that I've ever gotten money from, the way they determined the pre-money valuation was obscure at best. So, you know, our methodology may be just as obscure, but at least it's transparent and fair, so everyone knows the way we're determining what we think the idea is worth. And again, because CIMMIT is an academic institution fundamentally, you know, one of our missions is education, so this is all available on the website. You can download it. My email and phone number is there. You can call me. And I think if more, and we're seeing more and more groups start to use that basic approach to start to bridge the gap between the venture, the business world, and the academic world.
Mike, I didn't know, if I didn't know any better, I think you were baiting Jim and I.
Come on, Colin, come on, bring it on.
Actually, I just want to further amplify those, I think, really excellent comments from Howard and Mike, and that just to give you a little case study. So, the reason I bring this up is a couple points. That first, it's about it brings to the forefront how one can get very far with little capital and get really make a big impact as a result, and that also by leveraging things like the SBIR program, for example, you can go very far with that. And also the fact that it really, what I really want to amplify is that the focus on the customer, understanding that, you know, the so-called unmet need. I mean, that is paramount, because if you don't really understand that, then you really don't have a business. So the little case study is Smart Cells. I don't know if you ever heard of them, but they're a MIT spin-out. Todd Zines was the CEO, and they had developed, it was out of Bob Langer's lab at MIT, a glucose-regulated insulin product for diabetes. And so they started down that track. So there's some innovative thinking behind that, but they, from the company, from the get-go, they were thinking about, okay, who would be a potential customer for this at the end of the day? And the customer in this case would be, who would be that pharmaceutical company that could be of greatest interest to this product we could develop? And they started engaging very early on with the likes of Pfizer, Merck, and others to understand, okay, what is it you guys are looking for? What programs do you have in play right now? And where are those holes in your portfolio? Where could this potentially fit in? So that got them thinking, okay, of direction for their product development. So they started down that path. Now, they were, I would say, extremely capital efficient. They raised, in total, from only angel investors in the Boston area, so 150, it turns out, angel investors, $9.6 million, and that was over a couple rounds of investment. But they also received over $10 million in various grants from NIH, NSF, the SBIR program. They're very small, 17 people. They leveraged their relationships with Mass General, Joslin, Diabetes Clinic, NIH, and others. So they were looking for that leverage and amplification. So in the final, I guess 2 final points, that in the final transaction, as it turned out with Merck, that they retained over 50% of value for the founders and the team at the end. So using this approach, they were able, this leveraged approach and capital efficient approach, they retained a fair amount of value for the original team. So the punchline is that they first started with a license agreement with Merck, which then was transitioned into an acquisition of the asset for $80 million, but with a tail of up to $500 million on earnouts and milestones and such. And that works out to be about a 9.6x return on original invested capital. So I would say that if you're thinking about, you know, company formation, those are the kind of key highlights I would emphasize that you want to keep in mind. It's the focus on the customer, and to Mike's point, Howard's point, of identifying early on who could actually help you if they, you know, looking to understanding what their needs are first of all, and having them help you develop that product that then they can make use of. So having that partnership early on is key. And then capital efficiency, meaning leverage the resources you have. There's lots of resources out there. It's not just, you have to go to VCs all the time. Lots of public capital available, lots of services, which I think we'll hear more about from the SBIR program that could be really helpful. And then finally, that doesn't mean you don't always have to have $1 billion opportunity, right? You can make impact in smaller opportunities. So it's not this. I mean, we're looking for big returns because that's what our business is, and we have expectations of beating the market for our limited partners. Looking at not just a 20–30% return on invested capital, but 2, 3, 4x, right? So we have certain constraints on what we look at as being opportunities, but there's a great small to mid market in terms of opportunities that lots of problems that need to be solved that aren't those $1 billion opportunities that this kind of thinking plays very well.
I just add that if you're doing on the smart cells example, if you're doing drug delivery projects, it doesn't hurt to work with Dr. Langer.
Yes, right. You're good at that. That's what I've heard.
So we've talked a bit about the SBIR. What's that? I was going to just hand it over to you. We've talked a lot about the SBIR programs and various sources of capital there. So there you
go. As I mentioned, there is this new effort at the NIH to survey the SBIR program, and the subcommittee that I'm on met about a month ago, and we had a day-long discussion about this, and a couple of hours were spent specifically on the topic being discussed now of improving commercialization. And I just wanted to summarize for you some of the take-home points from that discussion, which are not very dissimilar from the comments that you've just heard, addressing this problem of the mismatch between, the impedance mismatch between academia and industry. So the first of them was what you just heard, the importance of not only targeting an unmet need, but as one person put it, Deshpande, who some of you may know, he said, a burning unmet need, that you should start with a burning unmet need. Then an assessment of the size of the market was thought to be important. As Colin just mentioned, it doesn't have to be gargantuan, but I think it certainly has to make business sense and meets with your goals and what you'd like to get out of it, but an assessment of the size of the market. Beginning then with having a documented pathway to commercialization, a plan for commercialization before you even embark on this process of trying to commercialize. The importance of education was emphasized over and over and over again. I was intrigued by the comment that you made that you had about 30% success rate with some of your seed ventures, but you thought that with appropriate business influence and mentoring that would be increased to 50%. And that was also echoed by this discussion in the panel of having mentorship from beginning to end, and mentorship about the whole range of things, from how to set up the lab, how to do experiments, how to do protocols, how to do those efficiently, to things that are further downstream about commercialization issues and product development, scaling up a prototype to size and so forth. So understanding everything in this whole pipeline from an idea and basic experiments to the marketplace. So the critical role of mentorship. And then connecting scientists with potential investors and business persons early on in the process, not waiting until you have this prototype and then you go out and try to sell it, to get a business-minded person involved in this process at a very early stage. So I think those were some of the key take-home messages. as regards the SBIR program, a couple of summary statements. So you probably know that there is a congressionally mandated set-aside, which traditionally has been 2.5% of the total NIH budget is required to be spent on SBIR, STTR applications. This program was reauthorized about a year ago, and with the reauthorization there were some significant changes to it, the most significant changes since the program was begun. First of all, the set-aside was increased, so there's this graduated scale of increasing a few tenths of a percent annually through 2017. And by 2017, it will go from 2.5% for SBIRs to 3.2%. And for STTRs, it will go from 0.3%, which is what it was last year, to 0.45%. So in broad speaking terms, basically this means that about $1 billion of the total NIH budget is required to be spent on SBIR, STTRs, or will be by 2017. There's also some changes in the size of these awards. They're not huge, but they may be worth noting. $150,000 for the phase 1, which is 6 months, and you can extend that. $1 million for phase 2 over 2 years. These awards can be increased. The language authorizes an increase of up to 50%, but not beyond that. And another significant change was the allowance of participation of businesses that have a majority ownership by venture capitalists. This change allows up to 25% of the SBIR funds and monies to be awarded to such firms. So I think those are the major changes. Now, I think Colin mentioned that SBIR funding is quite helpful, and our experience, my own experience with grantees from NIBIB, is that it is indeed helpful. You know, the first thing you do is you get a grant, like an R01, to pursue an idea, and you get this idea, and then you have something that you think can be commercialized, so then you go and you form a company, apply for an SBIR, or you get this award. At that point, you're rich, and that's probably the richest time of your life, it seems to be. Certainly in terms of the requirement for money versus the supply of money. So I think that ratio is most favorable at the moment that you first get the award. Then you start spending it, and there's this downward trend in available funds, and it seems to be this race to get to the point where you have a product that you could go to market with before your funds expire. The SBIR money, it seems, is very good in getting you through this initial stage of proof of concept, I would say, an early stage of product development. And typically, by that point, though, the money is out. And you have sort of a proof of concept, but you really don't have a prototype. And what I hear from our grantees is that before VC firms want to come in, they really want to see a working prototype. And you then enter this sort of, not the valley of death at that point, but the ditch of death, I think, is, as the current NSF director phrases it, the ditch of death, of having something that you feel pretty sure, you know, fundamentally works, but you really don't have this prototype that can attract VC funding, you know, where the risk has been removed to the extent that they're willing to come in, and you need just a few more millions of dollars. So I can think of a company right now that's in that situation. And I just talked with the vice president and CEO, and he said, if we just had $5 million more, they've just sort of run out of their current SBIR funds. We just need about $5 million more to do the studies that would allow us to get FDA pre-market approval for this agent that they have developed. And they're sort of caught in this relative ditch of death of something that in animals appears to work, but they haven't gotten it to the stage yet that they can do the kinds of clinical studies that VC firms would want to see before they come in with money. So I think SBIR monies are helpful to get you to that stage, but there does seem to be this ditch of death in there. And sometimes that may be filled in with angel funding, but people on this panel have a lot more knowledge than I do about this. This is just feedback I've gotten from our grantees, which is variably successful. But I think perhaps the take-home message, though, is to have a business plan that carries you through this whole process, to get somebody who's involved in the business arena early on to help you to develop a plan and an approach to getting adequate capital to see you through the whole process. And I'll just conclude by saying early on when I arrived at the NIH, we were visited by Albert Mann, who many of you may know of the Mann Institute, who's certainly made billions and billions. And he was actually coming to NIH with an idea, but we had a conversation with him. And in his conversation, he said he gives a talk, and in his talk he talks about the 10 things that are needed to be successful in a business, and he lists them in priority. And I was really struck when he said number 10 on the list in priority was a good idea. You know, the other things had to do with some of these practical issues that we just talked about. So I just leave you with that thought. I think a good idea is a great thing, but a practical business approach with expertise and involvement from the business community early on seems to be critical.
We're all talking about venture money and angel money and venture debt and SBIR grants, but I want to just make a point, and this may be a soapbox point, but the best money is money that comes from customers. There's no doubt about that in my mind, and I believe that for two reasons. One is, if you're trying to get money from customers, that means you must know who your customers are. So you've got to be asking them for money. If you know who your customers are, a lot of the other things that we talked about, understanding their needs, understanding their buying patterns, understanding how much they're willing to pay, takes care of itself. The second advantage is, if customers aren't giving you money, you know something's wrong. It's a much tighter feedback loop than if you're sitting on $1 million in SBIR money or $20 million in venture money, right? Well, the customer's not buying. Well, we got to do another study, or we got to do, you know, some market research. I mean, I will admit this. In one company, I raised $27 million, and we were sloppy because we had a lot of money in the bank, and when customers weren't buying, we weren't reacting fast enough. You can't do this with all of your businesses, but I would consider it a challenge. Just like you're architecting a solution to a particular technical problem, you also have to architect a sales process and a funding process that puts getting money from customers first. And you may not be able to do that, but that exercise will be an extremely helpful exercise as you mature your company.
Yeah, so I as a venture capital person, I can tell you that raising venture money is some of the most expensive capital you'll raise. The reasons to do it, I mean, the reasons are primarily that when you have a good syndicate of venture backers, you can absorb some changes of strategy and some missteps. But absolutely, if you have customer money available, if you can actually go out and market something, that's a far more desirable way to go.
Can I add a counterpoint to that? All right, I'm going to add a counterpoint to that. So I've had two experiences.
I know where you live, Colin.
Yeah, both having a customer-funded business, effectively, to get started, and the other, I guess it's the sort of anthem of VC's, the platform business. Now, the customer-funded business, Pfizer, actually, that funded us to get started on our businesses, and it was great because we knew what the problem was. We knew who our customer was, first of all. We knew what the problem we had to solve, and it turned out that problem was the same problem that all the other pharmaceutical companies had. So we knew if we solved it for Pfizer, then it would be like a cookie cutter approach, and that's what you want in business, right? You don't want to have to reinvent the wheel every single customer. It turned out to be great. We had a wonderful business. It literally was that hockey stick, revenue growth, and that was bought by Agilent. The other business was more of a platform business. So here was something, it was a device that could do everything, but it turned out, well, I wouldn't say nothing, but it could do everything. But the key is finding the one good thing that it could do really well that would solve a problem for a customer, right? And so that was a heck of a lot more work, and we went through a lot more capital. And so I would argue that. But at the end, so you're right, Mike, that there's that side of it. But at the end, that was a lot more valuable because the buyer of that asset, Life Technologies, not only bought it for a specific application we went to market with, but although it was discounted, we got credit for all the other applications we had developed that were moving forward in our pipeline. So that worked out to be a lot more valuable at the end of the day as an asset than simply just having that one sort of customer-focused solution. So, I'm not arguing one way or the other. All I can say is that it takes a lot more time and effort in dollars to have a platform to try and monetize a platform as opposed to a customer-driven solution.
So if those dollars are going to create something that has greater value, it's certainly worth doing. I'll also say that there is no correlation between capital in and capital out. There's no consistent correlation that says if I put $50 million into something, I'm going to get $500 million back. You actually plot them on a chart, and you can try to find a correlation. There's really not one there. Again, the exception is if you've got really valuable technology that takes that money and requires it to fully develop it, makes complete sense. But don't fall into the fallacy that putting an extra $20 million in is going to guarantee you an extra $100 million back. So I wanted to actually kind of switch gears for a second and kind of touch on a point that came out last night in some of the discussions and something that I've been sort of thinking over. So one of the comments last night from Stacy, who I think has left us from IDEO, was this notion that the cost of healthcare is an increasing challenge in the United States and globally. In the developing world, in Europe and in the U.S. and across the globe. And I'm struck by that because as I think about how innovation has been cast, in recent history, it's more around, creating better solutions, better outcomes. I mean, this idea of reducing cost as a basis of innovation, not that it's not been in the dialogue, but I think it's certainly been de-emphasized compared to other things that we've looked at in pushing technology forward. And what I wonder is, as we kind of go down the chain from, or go up the chain from the sources of innovation in academia, and as that gets developed and pushed through the system, how do we make sure that that from the very, very beginning, this notion of cost is being included? We've certainly seen it on the acquirer side. I mean, the pharma companies, the big medical device companies have certainly gotten this message that the notion of adding cost to the system is no longer going to be viable. I just want to hear from the panel, how is that fed through the chain, up and down the value chain?
Start at the beginning from the university perspective. So I've been at Columbia for 8 years doing tech transfer, and I can say that the word reimbursement never, ever entered anyone's vocabulary in our office probably until 3 years ago, really, So now we actually do raise it as a question, certainly in our validation fund reviews, in reviews for our Coulter funding, and even in invention assessments, right? So it's a question that comes up is who's going to pay for it? What are the incentives? What is the policy landscape, right? So for example, in orthopedics, you know, probably one day there will be a requirement for warranties essentially on revision surgeries, right? So that's going to have to come down the pike somehow. Very, very expensive. And right now, the original surgeon doesn't really own the revision, just gets passed on to somebody else. And so some of these larger kind of policy questions we actually do take a look at. But that's been, you know, that's just been a relatively new development, and we don't do it across the board. We do it for technologies that we think we're making big bets on. So, for example, technologies that we think are going to develop into portfolios rather than one-offs.
Oh, yeah, so I was thinking when you said cost, Jim, that you know, what comes to mind immediately is, well, the manufacturing cost. And, but I was thinking, well, yeah, that's true, right? But also you have to think about the cost of delivering the solution as well. So it's the cost of the sale, the cost of the marketing, and that oftentimes isn't looked at. You know, I was thinking that yesterday with Rick Valencia's talk, we chatted a bit afterwards about, you know, the whole, it sounds great, you know, wireless solutions for all, right? And that, but you think about it, that, you know, what's driving our health care costs in the United States? Well, it's the two big publicly funded programs, Medicaid and Medicare, and the recipients of those programs. Well, you know, I asked Rick, what's the penetration of wireless technology into those constituencies? He said very little. So I thought to myself, okay, well, despite the fact you could make a low-cost little gizmo, wireless gizmo, what's the cost now of getting that into the hands of those individuals that can make best use of it? So I think when you think of cost, you got to think of the entire chain of events that lead to that transaction of getting that product or service in the hands of the customer. So it's just bigger than the actual manufacturing costs alone.
Colin's going to want to chime in again, I'm sure. So interesting you should ask this. We being NIBIB, we just completed our strategic plan, or redo of our strategic plan. And one of the explicit goals in that strategic plan is the development of low-cost, effective, and accessible technologies, and technologies that are accessible by everyone. Emphasizing not sacrificing utility for cost, but low cost and effective. So this brings up the concept of value-driven solutions, value-driven engineering, for those of you in the audience who are engineers, and we look at that as being directly related to the ratio of utility over cost times complexity. So we'd want utility high, cost down, and complexity down. In the session earlier this morning on global health, there was a presentation about technologies that are suitable for low resource settings, so not a lot of moving parts, don't require huge amounts of power, don't require multiple Ph.D.s to operate them and maintain them and so forth, is a goal. Now, we've been at this for some time, even though this is now an explicit goal in our new strategic plan. And we've had some successes that really, I think, foretell the future. The first of them is from a huge company that you all be familiar with, General Electric. We funded General Electric about 6 or so years ago in an early initiative on low-cost technologies to develop a new ultrasound device, low-cost device, and they succeeded in 2010 with a device that is 20 times cheaper than its predecessor, and I don't know how many times much smaller, but goes from what used to be called portable, or something you put on a cart and roll around to the patient and plug it in the wall, to a handheld, in the pocket, battery powered, take it anywhere in the world, in the universe, fully operative color Doppler ultrasound device, which will have and is having a transformative effect on diagnostic medicine that is 20 times cheaper. $200,000 for a conventional ultrasound device, this handheld device now for $8,000. Another example, this one just this year, we instituted a program at our institute that was a prize given to undergraduate design teams. The prize has a name, it's called DEBUT. DEBUT is an acronym that stands for Design by Undergraduate Teams. Design being the DE, and by undergraduate teams. So we've made our first awards. The awards are given, the prizes are given in 3 categories. One in diagnostics, the other one therapeutics, and the third category is technologies for individuals in underserved areas, for underserved populations, or individuals with disabilities. And I would say all of the winners of the prize this year came in with devices that are relatively inexpensive. One of them is a $10,000 device that replaces a $2,000. I mean a $10, I'm sorry. 10,000. A $10 device that replaces a $2,000 device, and that is a spirometer that is used to diagnose chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which is a problem globally, particularly in underserved populations. Traditionally, spirometry, which is quantitatively measuring expiratory volume, lung capacity, rate of expiration of air, and so forth, is done with a device that uses a pressure transducer. These undergraduate scientists came up with this $10 device that's basically a block of plexiglass. You blow through it, they machine out an air pathway that causes the air to vibrate at different frequencies. The frequency is related to the speed of vibration. They use a microphone to listen to this, obtain these sounds as a function of time, Fourier transform that into extracting frequencies. Frequencies then are related to velocity, and from that they can determine the volume and volume flow rates. $10 this thing costs. And the other device, which speeds up surgery. We had one surgeon who told me he spends probably 6 hours a week just doing suturing. After he's done the complicated things, just suturing the abdomen back with a big abdominal incision. He spends 6 hours a week just suturing, and he could easily spend that time doing something more advanced. This other team that has developed this device they call Quick Stitch, which is now being commercialized, that greatly reduces the suturing time to minutes. And not only that, it addresses one of the other problems. The reason he spends so much time is there frequently, or I should say not infrequently, there's dehiscence, which is the wound comes apart, or you sew it up so tight, you have ischemia and you get dead tissue as a result of that. So this device also gets the tension right on the sutures. This thing costs $30. So yes, cost is important. It has definitely entered the engineering equation, and this concept of value engineering, where you look at utility up, cost down, complexity down, is where things are headed.
So Howard on the phone, do you have any comments on this topic?
I think that, again, you have to know where in the spectrum of devices you are, whether it's on the simple end or the more complex end, like, pacemakers or LVADs, but no matter where you are in today's world, cost is the key. And whether it's COGS or manufacturing or reducing the cost on that side, as was mentioned, or trying to figure out how it's going to fit into the clinical pathway and the cost within DRG, etc. The bottom line is, for us now, it is a major determinant of whether we're going to evaluate a project in an incubator or as part of the incubator. It used to be, if you build it, they will pay, and those days are well gone. The only situation where that's true is still in Europe, where it's somewhat of a different system, and in those cases, the CE mark, which would be the equivalent of like a PMA in the U.S., is really there to say that you prove safely and you're making your device repeatedly the same every single time. They leave it to the physicians to make the decision whether they want to use the device. However, the money that's available to physicians there is more in a general pot, and so they can choose to use it on this or use it on that, but they still worry about cost because while they may not have a budget for your particular device, they have a budget in which they have to work. But certainly in the U.S., in the PMA process right now, reimbursement is right there, part of the whole thing. So hopefully you can get reimbursement on the other way out when you're done. But without a doubt, it's here to stay, and it's not going to go away.
Yeah, and just to kind of close out on it, I think what I would say is that the way you calculate cost or the level at which you look at it, there are different horizons or different kind of focal lengths to kind of think about it. So, I think in the largest sense, you can think about the impact on the healthcare system generally, looking at things like avoiding readmissions, avoiding complications. You can sort of make arguments around that being ways to sort of reduce the cost or justify the price of an intervention. I'll only say that when you go down that path, the level of evidence is increasing, right? So you need to be prepared to show at some point along the way that those cost avoidance measures are actually real and they actually do come around. They're not just notional. So we have about 20 minutes left, and I'd like to have some time for the audience to ask some questions. We'll save 5 minutes at the very end to do just a quick recap. But at this point, if there are any questions from the audience, please identify yourselves.
Yeah, that's a huge question. There's a number of different approaches to that, right? And probably one of the most controversial, at least in tech transfer circles, is the free agent, right? This free agency model where we return back to kind of the pre-Bayh-Dole days, and inventors can pursue their own agents, if you will, their own tech transfer agents outside of the university. And there's some big inventor advocates for that approach. I mean, again, I'm not expressing the views of my employer, but there is some, there's definitely discussion at our professional association meetings about that. Personally, I don't know that that's actually, as an inventor, I would like that option. But the other thing too is that not all inventors are created equal in terms of their ability and and the time and resources that they have to do their own networking, to find those folks, and just being in the tech transfer office and interacting probably with hundreds of investors, companies, entrepreneurs every year. We see a lot of traffic in the Columbia Tech Transfer Office. There's a huge variety in the quality of those external partners, right? So if I were an inventor kind of off on my own, you will have to sift through all of this stuff. And I think the best tech transfer offices will identify the quality partners, the people who will really serve as partners, not waste your time. We certainly get probably on in any given week, we probably get 20 inquiries, just online inquiries, web inquiries from all over the world, which are total wastes of time. Total waste of time. And you can imagine that if you were a solo inventor trying to figure this all out on your own, it would be extremely difficult to navigate all of the noise. And so again, that's one model, right? We think of tech transfer at Columbia as a scale business, frankly. So if you look at the metrics of tech transfer across the industry, you'll see it's dominated by basically blockbusters, right? So you have a few hits that drive most of the revenues in the industry. And so when you have a business like that, it's kind of like a lottery. The more tickets you have, the higher chances you have of winning. But the infrastructure, typically the way tech transfer is done now, the smallest research institutions have to have a tech transfer office. It's almost, you just have to have one person or two people. And the infrastructure to support good quality tech transfer, with a two-person office, it's just not possible. So you see, I think up in Massachusetts, actually in Boston area, you have a bunch of the smaller schools actually banding together to share marketing resources and databases and so forth. And I think that's probably another trend in tech transfers, that you'll see some consolidation. I don't want to call it consolidation, it's a business term, but you'll see some better cooperation, I guess, sharing of resources among some of the smaller institutions so that they can get that type of scale and achieve better efficiencies.
Can I make a comment and observation that so what I've seen with tech transfer offices, there's a lot of there's a transactional component that, okay, you want to license this technology, great, well, here's our terms, and you negotiate, so it's a transaction. Well, that's fine, that's part of what tech transfer offices do. But looking from a company formation perspective, where I see the perhaps it's a trend, I don't know, where I see it's most effective is where there's sort of a partnership kind of model that combines within, say, the university, within the university being part of a larger consortium. I'm thinking in particular of QB3 out in the Bay Area. I think they've been very successful. They're it's California California something Institute Quantitative Biology, yeah, QB3, and they've been in existence for about 6-7 years now. And it's a consortium, I guess, of the 3 UC campuses in the Bay Area. What they've done is agreed to focus in life sciences and accelerate company formation by lowering the barrier to allow PIs within those institutions to be able to spin out the fruits of their labors. But the thing is that, what's interesting is that you look at the amount of dollars that NIH funds in the Bay Area, in San Francisco, in Boston, New York, the major sort of academics, medical area centers. And you look at, there was a study, actually, I encourage you all to check it out, in translational science, translational medicine, I think it is, that looking at the results from those multi-billion-dollar investments by NIH in academic research. And the San Francisco area, Boston area, because of the sort of infrastructures that are there, the ecosystems, and QB3 is part of that, CIMMIT's part of that in Boston, and there's others, that connects the dots between the PIs in the universities, the tech transfer offices, the folks like ourselves that are looking for investment, the entrepreneurs, that all that sort of mix results in not only a higher than average rate of company formation, but also economic development. And I think that's a key point relative to the roles of tech transfer offices. So, it's just not simply a transactional shop, but I think it's more of a partnership model that you'll see more and more of that. So I guess that was more of an observation and a comment than anything else. That I think, the role of organizations like CIMMYT are an important part of that ecosystem. So I just teed you up, Mike.
So I'm not a member of the tech transfer community. I'm more of an outsider, so I don't really know what I'm talking about in these statements. But from my perspective, there are three things that need to happen. One is that the tech transfer offices need to not be viewed as a cost center. Many times they're under-resourced and they're viewed as a loss in the organization, particularly in medical centers. I think if the Board of Trustees begins to view them as a source of revenue, a source of profit to exploit the assets that exist in the organization, the way they act will be different. A second thing I think is important is related more to the investigators, and this might be more of an attitude than anything, or it could be education, I guess. The asset isn't the patent. I mean, a lot of people say, I filed an invention disclosure and now I've got a patent, aren't I successful? The asset is the solution. It's the small I in the small piece. So there may be patents, there may be know-how, but there's business models, there's understanding the customers, there's solutions. So as investigators going into the tech transfer office, I would encourage us all to look at it that way. I mean, my group builds businesses, and I would say every one of the businesses that we've built, we looked at the original invention disclosures and patents that were filed, and they sucked. I wouldn't do patents on them either, right? There wasn't a patent strategy there. It was just a little chunk of technology. So as investigators, you need to be looking at the overall solution. You're trying to build a business. You're trying to solve a problem, not have an invention. And then the third point is just a tactical one, I think. As we heard, right, a lot of the success in tech transfer is dominated by a few big wins. I'm not smart enough to know which solution is going to be a winner in 5 or 10 years. So my particular attitude is similar to what's happening at BU and North Carolina and a few other universities, where they're saying, initially, anyone can license anything. It's a very low barrier to entry for an outsider to license something from the university. Kind of a standard contract, flat fee, take it or leave it. And the fee is like $10,000 or $20,000. And then renegotiate only if they're successful, because everybody knows that if they're successful, it's going to be renegotiated anyway. And if they're not successful, it doesn't matter. So the head of the tech transfer office at BU says he's trying to reduce friction and maximize collisions. So not try to pick the 1 or 2 that are going to be winners, license out anything that anyone will take, and then figure out, let them sort themselves out and figure out who's successful, and then work to redefine the terms at that point.
Well, I think what we'll do in the last 10 minutes, I will commit to sticking around for questions after we finish up. But I want to spend the last 10 minutes just going down the folks on the panel. One of the comments last night that kind of resonated with me was that we've discussed a lot of challenges, a lot of clinical unmet needs, a lot of system-wide unmet needs, and a lot of global unmet needs through the course of this discussion over the last couple of days. And if anyone in the world is going to solve these problems, I mean, it's the people that are in the room, people that have come to this conference, people that are interested in this topic, and people that have the background and skills that the folks in the audience have. And I want to make sure that the panelists have a chance to kind of give some insight and guidance, sort of the one piece of advice they would give to the folks in the audience as they think about translational innovation, translating innovation to the market and actually commercializing their ideas successfully. So to that, let's start with Howard from the Ether. Howard, do you have any thoughts on that for the audience?
You know, I do, and my one suggestion is do what you do best. And I would encourage the people who are primarily in academia to not try and become business people or, you know, whatever. The answer is that everybody contributes in a different way to the development of a product. I have a certain set of skills. I'm really good from back of the napkin through the first, you know, developing a device through the first 30 patients. But I'm not the best person to take it from there through, you know, definitive clinical trials in you know, multiple places, or those people are not the best people to take it through acquisition and marketing. And neither am I or any of those people necessarily the best people to do the basic science development or finding a elegant solution that can develop into a product early on in academia. So I think that you have to understand where your skill set are, where you contribute. It doesn't mean you can't transition to become one of those other people. But especially early on in your career where you have a set of skills that are really good or that you've honed, I would take advantage of them and become conversant and seek advice and counsel, has been, you know, said on the panel in a number of different ways, from people who have more experience later on, to make sure you're going after the right thing and that what you're working on will be, you know, fundable, acquirable, whatever. But stick to your strengths and then build on them as you move further along in your career.
I have nothing significant to add. Fair answer.
All right. You know, I'll throw something out there. I think Jack had a slide from the previous session that most of the folks in the audience are under 30, essentially, right? So like over half of the folks in the audience are under 30. So I think this is a great time for exploration. I don't know if I completely agree with Howard, maybe for the over 70 set who have already gone home to go to sleep, but sorry if there's anyone over 70 in the room. That's right. Anyways, but so, I mean, we at Columbia, we run a fantastic internship program with the Tech Transfer Office. We have like over 30 Ph.D., M.B.A., M.D. students in that mix. And we routinely get just rave reviews about the program because it's really the opportunity for them to try out, you know, to put themselves in a different situation, in a different mindset, to think about what it might be like to be a VC or to be in a position where you're making a decision about a particular technology. So in our case, our internship program, all of our 300 plus inventions every year are analyzed by these PhD, primarily PhD, graduate students essentially. And those assessments are shared with our patent attorneys, our outside counsel, the inventors, et cetera. They're used as real life working documents that we base our patent investment decisions on. And I think, you know, so for those of you who have an opportunity, you are obviously already have an interest in translational research, but for those of you who have an opportunity to get involved with things kind of outside of what you would normally do in the lab, I would encourage it. I'm sure the PIs in the room would hate to hear that because they want you in the lab, but this is a great time for that kind of exploration at this point in your careers, and not sure when you would otherwise get that that chance or the freedom that you have right now.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, really well put. The only thing I can really add is that, you know, there's abundant, you know, it's surprising when I was thinking back, you almost 10 years ago now when I was starting, that, this focusing on the entrepreneurial thing, that there wasn't much resources available, like in terms of the mentorship. I mean, you really had to work hard to go find that. But now, in the Boston area and, in Houston, I was just over the Houston Technology Center. There's all sorts of programs available through the SBIR program and NIH, NSF. There's lots of infrastructure to support entrepreneurship. And I think, if anything, I would encourage you all to look at wherever you are located and really take advantage of those resources. Because really, at the end of the day, it's all about knowledge. And because when you come talk to myself or Jim, right, we've already talked to, I don't know how many people in any given area. We have a really good idea what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. So, you're up against folks that already have a lay of the land, understand in depth a given area. So you have to play at the same level as we do. And so that to do that, you need to go out and educate yourselves, right? Talk to customers, talk to people where the problems are. Because at the end, that's only going to do yourself. I mean, it's not just to be able to converse with Jim and I, but more and convince us that that your venture is worth funding. But more importantly, it's really convince yourselves that this is something worth your time and effort. Because life is short. And you're right that, you can really be an entrepreneur at any point in your life, but it does take a lot of time and energy. And, odds are it's not going to work out. So a lot of it is really choosing that problem. And how you're going to choose the problem to work on, it's really going out and talking to people and educating yourselves as to fundamentally, what is that problem that needs to be solved that's going to really make that big difference. So I guess that would be the only last thoughts I would have.
Sorry.
Colin triggered a thought, but I would endorse a statement about identifying a problem. So we've all talked about beginning with an unmet need, a burning need. How do you determine that? If we look at a couple of the successful programs that have emerged in the last few years in academia, Stanford being one of them, Hopkins being another, they spend months in the hospital in their biodesign program, just going through the hospital, making a list of problems that they identified that could be improved upon, and then spend time actually studying those problems to decide which of those problems are most ripe for a solution, and that a solution could be fashioned for. So I think studying the problem space is maybe the explicit statement there, actually studying the problem space.
Okay, well, thank you, audience, for your attention. I thank the panelists for enduring the questions. And please join me in a round of applause for the panelists. So I think, are we going to close or?
The fact that you can keep an old guy like me awake. I'm almost 70 and...
You're not in bed, yeah.